The television studio fell silent as Jasmine Crockett reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small, recording device. Across from her sat Peterson, the famous psychologist, author, his face frozen in disbelief. Just moments before he had called her completely unfit for public office and questioned her intelligence on live television. Now, with millions watching, Crockett was about to play an audio recording that would turn Peterson's world upside down. "Dr. Peterson," she said calmly, her finger hovering over the play button. "Before we continue this discussion about fitness for office, I think America needs to hear something you said when you thought nobody was recording." Peterson's confident smirk vanished. The host leaned forward. The audience held their breath. What happened next would become the most watched political confrontation of the year, sparking a national debate about hypocrisy, power, and truth, American politics. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the explosive political moments that are reshaping our country. The recording device clicked. Everything changed. To understand how this confrontation reached such explosive heights, you need to know the two people sitting across from each other in that studio that night. Jasmine Crockett had become one of the most talked about freshman representatives in Congress. At just years old, the former civil rights attorney from Texas had already made waves with her sharp questioning during committee hearings and her ability to cut through political nonsense with laser-focused precision. Her background wasn't typical for Washington. She'd grown up in a working-class family, put herself through law school, and spent years fighting for people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. But Crockett had also become a target. Conservative commentators regularly attacked her speaking style, questioned her qualifications, and suggested she was out of her depth in the halls of Congress. Some of the criticism crossed lines that made many Americans uncomfortable, with undertones that seemed to have less to do with her policies and more to do with who she was. On the other side sat Dr. Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist, had become a global phenomenon. With millions of followers hanging on his every word, Peterson had built an empire around his philosophy of personal responsibility and traditional values. His books topped bestseller lists. Speaking tours sold out arenas, and his online lectures garnered millions of views. Peterson had recently expanded his commentary into American politics, particularly targeting what he called the radical left takeover of institutions. He'd become increasingly vocal about politicians he believed were destroying Western civilization, and Jasmine Crockett had become one of his favorite targets. The tension between them had been building for months, creating a slow-burning conflict that political observers had been watching with growing interest. Peterson had made several public statements questioning Crockett's intelligence and fitness for office. He'd suggested during interviews that she was a perfect example of how identity politics was putting unqualified people in positions of power. Each comment had gotten more personal, more pointed, and more dismissive. The escalation had begun during Crockett's first major committee hearing, where she had questioned a witness about discriminatory lending practices. Line of questioning had been sharp and well-informed, leading to significant policy changes within weeks. Peterson had appeared on several programs afterward, suggesting that her performance was more about performance art than serious governance. "What we saw in that hearing," Peterson had said, during one particularly memorable television appearance, was someone who had clearly been coached on what questions to ask, but who lacked the deeper understanding necessary to follow up appropriately. It's the difference between reading from a script and actually understanding the material. Comment had stung because it played into every stereotype about young politicians, particularly young politicians from marginalized communities. It suggested that Crockett's success was not the result her own intelligence and preparation, but rather the product of behind-the-scenes coaching and identity-based promotion. Crockett's response at the time had been measured and professional. She had issued a brief statement noting that she had written her own questions, done her own research, and achieved the policy outcomes she had promised her constituents. But privately, those close to her said, the attack had crystallized her understanding of what she was really facing. This wasn't just policy disagreement or normal political opposition. This was a systematic attempt to delegitimize her presence in Congress by questioning her fundamental competence. Peterson wasn't just disagreeing with her positions. He was arguing that she shouldn't be taken seriously as an intellectual equal, that her achievements were somehow artificial or unearned. The attacks had continued over the following months, each one slightly more personal than the last. Peterson had questioned her educational background, despite her law degree from a prestigious university. He suggested that her success as a civil rights attorney was due to lowered standards in legal education and practice. He had even questioned whether she understood the historical and philosophical foundations of the democratic system she had sworn to defend. Each attack had been carefully crafted to avoid explicit references to race or gender, but the subtext was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Peterson was essentially arguing that traditional standards of excellence were being abandoned to make room for people like Crockett, and that this represented a dangerous decline in American institutional quality. What Peterson didn't know was that each attack was being carefully documented by Crockett's team. They were building a comprehensive file of his statements, tracking patterns in his rhetoric, and waiting for the right opportunity to respond. Crockett, drawing on her experience as a trial lawyer, understood that the best time to respond to character assassination wasn't immediately after each attack, but rather at a moment when the response could be decisive and comprehensive. Crockett, for her part, had mostly ignored the attacks. She'd focused on her work, passing legislation, fighting for her constituents. But those close to her said she was keeping track, building a case, waiting for the right moment. That moment came when Peterson agreed to a televised debate about the state of American democracy. The topic was supposed to be broad, discuss political discourse, the role of expertise in government, and the future of democratic institutions. But everyone knew this was really about their personal feud broadcast live to millions of Americans hungry for political drama. The stakes couldn't have been higher. For Peterson, this was a chance to prove his critique of modern politics was correct, to show that his intellectual approach could expose what he saw as the emptiness of identity-based politics. A strong performance would solidify his position as a serious political commentator and potentially launch him into even greater influence in American conservative circles. For Crockett, this was about more than defending herself. She was representing everyone who had been told they didn't belong in positions of power. Everyone whose qualifications had been questioned based on their background rather than their achievements. A poor showing would validate every criticism that had been thrown at her and potentially derail her political career before it really began. Neither of them knew that Crockett had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence that would completely flip the script on everything. Peterson had said about her and politicians like her, the debate started cordially enough. Peterson, wearing his typical dark suit and speaking in his measured professorial tone, laid out his thesis about the decline of merit-based selection in American institutions. He spoke about the importance of competence over identity, the dangers, lowering standards, and the need for serious people in serious positions. We're living through a time, feelings have replaced facts, when appearance matters more than substance. Peterson said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of concern and authority that had made him famous. And nowhere is this more evident than in our political institutions. He gestured with his hands as he spoke, his signature mannerism that his followers had come to recognize. Peterson's confidence was evident, every word, every pause, every slight smile that crossed his face when he made what he considered a particularly insightful point. This was his element, the world of ideas, academic discourse, intellectual debate. He had built his reputation on his ability to articulate complex philosophical concepts in ways that resonated with millions of people who felt frustrated with modern political discourse. Peterson continued his opening remarks with increasing intensity. What we're witnessing is nothing less than the collapse of institutional integrity. Universities, corporations, government agencies, they've all been captured by an ideology that prioritizes group identity over individual merit. The result is predictable: incompetence disguised as progress, mediocrity elevated as virtue. It is virtue. Audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement with his familiar themes. These were ideas that had made Peterson a best-selling author and sought-after speaker. His critique of what he called postmodern neo-Marxism had struck a chord with people who felt that traditional standards of excellence were being abandoned in favor of what they saw as political correctness. Crockett listened patiently, taking notes, nodding occasionally. When it was her turn to respond, she spoke clearly about her record, her education, and her work on behalf of her constituents. She outlined specific legislation she'd authored, cases she'd won as a lawyer, and the measurable impact she'd had on people's lives. I think the American people are smart enough to judge politicians based on results, not rhetoric, she said. My constituents didn't send me here because of my identity. They sent me here because I get things done. For the first minutes, it was a relatively standard political debate. Peterson would make broad philosophical points about governance and competence. Crockett would respond with specific examples, policy details. The audience seemed engaged, but not electrified. Then Peterson began to get more personal. "Representative Crockett," he said, leaning forward slightly, "speak about results, but I have to ask, what actual qualifications did you have for this office beyond checking certain demographic boxes? Where's the evidence that you understand the complex responsibilities of governance?" The question hung in the air. Crockett's expression didn't change, but those watching closely noticed her grip tightened slightly on her pen. "Peterson," she replied evenly, "I'm curious about your definition of qualifications. I spent 15 years as a civil rights attorney, won cases before federal courts, authored legislation that passed with bipartisan support, and was elected by over 180,000 voters who seemed to think I was qualified enough. What specific qualifications are you suggesting I lack?" Peterson pressed on, his voice taking on that lecturing tone his critics found condescending. "I'm talking about the kind of deep understanding of history, philosophy, and human nature that real leadership requires. I'm talking about intellectual rigor necessary to grapple with complex policy questions. Too often we see politicians who are good at talking points, but lack the fundamental knowledge base for serious governance." The audience stirred. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The host tried to interject, but Peterson continued. "And frankly, Representative Crockett, based on your public statements and your approach to policy, I have serious doubts about whether you possess that intellectual rigor. You seem to confuse passion with competence, volume with substance." That's when something changed in Crockett's demeanor. Her polite smile remained, but her eyes sharpened with the focus of a predator who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. She set down her pen, deliberately placed both hands flat on the table, and looked directly at Peterson with an intensity that made several audience members lean forward in their seats. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. Throughout the early part of the debate, Crockett had been responding as a politician, measured, diplomatic, focused on policy details. But now, something different was emerging. This was Crockett, the trial lawyer, the woman who had spent 15 years in courtrooms facing down opponents who underestimated her, who had built her reputation on being able to dismantle opposing arguments with surgical precision. "Dr. Peterson," she said slowly, her voice still calm, carrying a new edge that hadn't been there before. "That's a fascinating perspective on intellectual rigor, the qualifications necessary for governance. I'm particularly interested in your views on these topics, given some of the statements you've made recently about democratic institutions and the people who participate in them." Peterson's confident expression flickered for just a moment, like someone who had just heard something unexpected in a familiar song. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Representative Crockett's smile became more pronounced, but it wasn't the polite political smile she had been wearing earlier. This was the smile of someone who had been dealt a royal flush and was about to reveal her cards. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm suggesting, Dr. Peterson. You see, you've built quite a reputation on telling people to clean up their own house before criticizing others. You talk constantly about personal responsibility and intellectual honesty. You've made a career out of challenging people to examine their own behavior and motivations before judging others." Reached into her briefcase with deliberate slowness, her movements calculated for maximum dramatic effect. "So I think America deserves to hear what you really think when you believe no one is listening. I think they deserve to know whether your public advocacy for democratic institutions matches your private views about the people who participate in those institutions." The studio had gone completely quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Peterson's face was now visibly tense, though he was clearly trying to maintain his composure. "Oh, I think you know exactly what I'm suggesting," Crockett said, her voice still calm but carrying a new edge. "You see, Dr. Peterson, you've built quite a reputation on telling people to clean up their own house before criticizing others. You talk constantly about personal responsibility and intellectual honesty, so I think America deserves to hear what you really think when you believe no one is listening." The studio had gone completely quiet. Peterson's face was now visibly tense, though he was trying to maintain his composure. "Representative Crockett, I'm not sure what game you think you're playing here, but this isn't a game, Doctor. This is about truth. You've spent months questioning my fitness for office, my intelligence, my qualifications. You've suggested that politicians like me destroying democratic institutions through our supposed incompetence. But I have to wonder, what does that say about your own fitness to make such judgments?" Crockett held up the recording device. "This audio was recorded 3 weeks ago at a private dinner in Toronto. You were speaking to a group of donors about American politics. The person who recorded it felt that the American people deserved to hear what you really think about the democratic process you claim to want to protect." Peterson was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. "Representative Crockett, I don't know what you think you have there. But oh, I know exactly what I have. Dr. Peterson, the question is, do you want to explain it before I play it, or should we all just listen together?" The tension in the room was electric. The host looked back and forth between them, clearly unsure how to proceed. Audience was completely silent, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. Peterson straightened his tie, his professorial demeanor now showing cracks. "I stand by everything I've said publicly about the importance of competence in governance." "That's interesting," Crockett said, finger hovering over the play button. "Because according to this recording, your private views about governance and democracy are quite different from your public ones. In fact, they're rather shocking." Crockett pressed play. Peterson's voice filled the studio. Clear, unmistakable, speaking to what sounded like a small group in an intimate setting. The audio quality was good enough that every word was crisp and understandable. "The truth is," Peterson's recorded voice said, "democracy as it exists in America is fundamentally broken. These people, the voters, they're not equipped to make the complex decisions that governance requires. They vote based on emotion, on tribal loyalty, on 30-second sound bites. It's a farce." The studio erupted in gasps and murmurs. Peterson's face had gone pale, but the recording continued. "I mean, look at who they elect. People like this Crockett woman in Texas. The voters see someone who looks like them or sounds like them, and they think that's qualification enough. They have no idea what governance actually requires. No understanding history, philosophy, economics. They're children playing with dynamite." Crockett paused the recording. The silence that followed was deafening. "Dr. Peterson," she said quietly, "you like to explain to our audience how calling voters children playing with dynamite squares with your public support for democratic institutions." Peterson tried to recover, his voice shaky. That recording was taken out of context. I was speaking theoretically about the challenges facing democratic systems. Oh, we're just getting started. Crockett interrupted, pressing play again. Peterson's voice continued. The real tragedy is that we pretend their opinions matter equally. A voter who spent 30 years studying economics and policy. Their vote counts the same as someone who gets their political information from social media memes. It's absurd. In any rational system, expertise would be weighted appropriately. More gasps from the audience. Someone shouted, "What?" from the back of the room, but the recording wasn't finished. The media plays along with this charade because it's profitable. They treat every election like it's a legitimate contest between equals, when really it's often between someone qualified, someone who's popular. Take this Peterson-Crockett debate they want me to do. I'll destroy her intellectually. Obviously, but the media will frame it like it was a real contest between equals. It's theater designed to make the masses feel like their opinions matter. Crockett stopped the recording. Again, the studio was in chaos now, with audience members talking loudly to each other, some standing up, others shaking their heads in disbelief. "Dr. Peterson," Crockett said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Just heard yourself say you would destroy me intellectually. Obviously, you also heard yourself call this very debate theater designed to make the masses feel like their opinions matter. So, I have to ask, if you have such contempt for democratic processes, and the voters who participate in them, exactly are you doing here?" Peterson was visibly struggling now, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to formulate a response. "Representative Crockett, that conversation was private, and you're mischaracterizing." "There's more," Crockett said firmly, pressing play one final time. "The honest truth. Most of these politicians, especially the ones the progressives elect, they're functionally illiterate when it comes to serious policy. They can memorize talking points, sure, but ask them to think through the second and third order effects of their proposals. Forget it. Crockett's a perfect example. She sounds good in sound bites, but she's got the intellectual depth of a puddle. The real tragedy is that the system rewards that kind of surface-level performance." The recording ended. The studio exploded. Half the audience was on their feet, some shouting in anger, others in shock. The host was frantically trying to restore order. Peterson sat frozen, his face red, looking like he wanted to disappear. Crockett remained calm throughout the chaos, waiting for quiet to return. When it finally did, she spoke slowly and deliberately. "Dr. Peterson, you've just heard yourself say several remarkable things. You called voters children playing with dynamite. You suggested that democracy is a farce, and that elections are theater. You called me functionally illiterate with the intellectual depth of a puddle, and you described this very debate as something where you would destroy me intellectually." Obviously, she paused, letting the words sink in. "So, I have some questions for you, and I think the American people deserve honest answers. First, if you believe democracy is a farce, and voters are incompetent children, why are you here trying to influence those same voters? Second, you think I'm intellectually inferior and this debate is meaningless theater, why did you agree to participate? Third, how can anyone trust your public advocacy for personal responsibility, truth-telling, when your private statements show such contempt for the very people you're supposedly trying to help?" Peterson tried to interrupt, but Crockett wasn't finished. "But here's what I find most interesting. Dr. Peterson, you spent the first part of tonight questioning my qualifications, my intelligence, and my fitness for office. You suggested I was chosen based on demographics rather than merit. You implied that I lacked the intellectual rigor for serious governance. But this recording reveals something fascinating about your approach to intellectual discourse." She leaned forward slightly. "You see, your private comments, you said you would destroy me intellectually. Obviously, that word obviously is very telling. It suggests you believed this would be easy, that I was such an inferior intellect that defeating me in debate would be automatic. You came here tonight expecting to steamroll someone you considered intellectually defenseless. The audience was hanging on every word now. But Dr. Peterson, here's the problem with that approach. You were so confident in your intellectual superiority that you didn't prepare for the possibility that I might actually be competent. You didn't consider that I might have done my homework. You didn't think about the possibility that someone you dismissed as having the intellectual depth of a puddle might have been paying attention to your private statements. Peterson finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Representative Crockett, those statements were taken out of context, and I think no, Dr. Peterson, Crockett said firmly. You don't get to claim context now. These weren't off-the-cuff remarks taken out of context. These were thoughtful, detailed statements about your fundamental beliefs regarding democracy, voters, and politicians like me. You spoke for nearly 10 minutes about these topics to a room full of donors. This wasn't a gotcha moment. This was you, revealing what you really think when you believe you're in friendly company. She stood up, voice rising slightly for the first time. And here's what I find most revealing about tonight, Dr. Peterson. You came here believing you would easily defeat someone you considered intellectually inferior. You prepared for a debate against a caricature of your own creation, the incompetent politician chosen for demographic reasons. But you didn't prepare for a debate against me. The actual person sitting across from you. The audience began to applaud slowly at first, then building to a thunderous ovation. See, Dr. Peterson, while you were busy dismissing my qualifications and telling donors how intellectually superior you are, I was doing something you apparently didn't expect. Preparing. I was researching. I was gathering evidence. I was, as you might say, taking personal responsibility for this moment. Peterson slumped in his chair, completely defeated. So here's my question for you, Dr. Peterson. If this debate is meaningless theater, if I'm intellectually inferior, if democracy is a farce, then what just happened here? How did someone with the intellectual depth of a puddle manage to so thoroughly expose the contradictions in your worldview? How did someone you expected to destroy obviously end up destroying your credibility instead? The applause was deafening now. Peterson looked around the studio like a trapped animal, clearly wanting to leave, but unable to do so gracefully. The truth is, Peterson tonight has revealed something important about both of us. It's shown that I came prepared to engage seriously with your ideas and your criticisms. It's shown that you came here expecting an easy victory over someone you never bothered to take seriously. So I'll ask you one more time, who exactly is intellectually unfit for serious discourse? The immediate aftermath of the debate was unlike anything political observers had seen in years. Before the program had even finished airing, clips of the recording were spreading across social media like wildfire. Peterson exposed began trending within minutes, followed quickly by Crockett prepared and puddle depth, the last one a reference to Peterson's dismissive comment about Crockett's intellectual capacity. The social media explosion was just the beginning of what would become a media phenomenon that dominated news cycles for weeks. Within the first hour, the recording had been shared over times across various platforms. Political commentators who had been watching other programs immediately switched their focus to analyzing what they were calling the political upset of the decade. Television networks scrambled to get reactions from political figures, academics, and media personalities. The debate had ended at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, but by midnight, 3 major networks had assembled emergency panels to discuss the implications. Political operatives from both parties found themselves fielding calls from journalists wanting to understand how such a complete reversal of fortune had occurred so quickly. The recording itself became the subject of intense scrutiny. Audio experts were brought in to verify its authenticity, though no one seriously questioned whether it was real. Peterson's distinctive voice, speaking patterns were too recognizable to fake convincingly. Instead, the focus shifted to the circumstances under which it had been recorded and how Crockett had obtained it. News organizations began reaching out to attendees of the Toronto dinner where the recording had been made. Several confirmed that Peterson indeed made the statements captured in the audio, and some provided additional context that made his comments seem even more damaging. According to multiple sources, Peterson had spent nearly an hour that evening expressing similar views about democracy, voters, and American political institutions. The story took on additional dimensions, as reporters discovered that the dinner had been a fundraising event for a think tank that promoted what they called epistocracy, the idea that political power should be distributed according to knowledge and expertise rather than through universal suffrage. Peterson's comments suddenly seemed less like private frustrations and more like a coherent ideological position that directly contradicted his public support for democratic institutions. The reaction from viewers was swift and decisive. The FI network's phones lit up with calls from people wanting to express their shock at Peterson's private statements. Social media filled with reactions ranging from outrage to vindication to dark humor. Memes began appearing almost immediately, with Peterson's obviously comment becoming a particularly popular target for mockery. But the story was just beginning. Within hours of the debate's conclusion, investigative journalists were digging deeper into Peterson's private statements and appearances. The recording Crockett had played was just a snippet of a longer conversation. News organizations began reaching out to attendees of that Toronto dinner to learn more about what else Peterson had said. What they discovered painted an even more damaging picture. Multiple sources confirmed that Peterson had spent much of that evening expressing contempt not just for individual politicians, but for the entire democratic process. He'd reportedly suggested that voting should be restricted to people who could pass competency tests, and that universal suffrage was a historical mistake that was destroying Western civilization. Meanwhile, Crockett's performance had transformed her from a rising politician into a national sensation overnight. Video clips of her systematic dismantling of Peterson's arguments were shared millions of times. Her calm, methodical approach to exposing his hypocrisy was praised by political commentators across the spectrum, many noting that she had demonstrated exactly the kind of intellectual rigor Peterson claimed she lacked. The contrast between their preparations for the debate became a major storyline. While Peterson had apparently assumed victory would be automatic, Crockett had spent weeks researching his statements, gathering evidence, and preparing for various scenarios. Multiple sources revealed that she had known about the Toronto recording for over a month, but had strategically waited for the right moment to use it. The political implications were enormous. Peterson, who had built his brand around intellectual honesty and personal responsibility, was now exposed as someone who said very different things in private than he did in public. His credibility as a commentator on democratic institutions was in tatters, and several universities began reconsidering their invitations for him to speak. More broadly, the incident sparked a national conversation of expertise, democracy, and political discourse. Peterson's private comments about voters being children playing with dynamite particularly resonated with people who felt that elite contempt for ordinary citizens was a major problem in American politics. Conservative commentators found themselves in a difficult position. Many had praised Peterson's critique of politicians like Crockett, but his private statements about democracy and voters put them in the awkward position of defending someone who had expressed contempt for their own audiences. Liberal commentators, meanwhile, used the incident to highlight what they saw as the fundamental hypocrisy of intellectual elitism disguised as populist concern. They pointed out that Peterson's attack on Crockett's qualifications had been exposed as being based not on her actual record, but on his assumptions about who deserved to hold power. The recording also raised important questions about political commentary and public discourse. How many other prominent commentators held private views that contradicted their public positions? How often were attacks on politicians based on genuine policy concerns versus personal prejudices or assumptions? Crockett herself became the subject of intense media attention, but she handled it with the same measured approach she had shown during the debate. In interviews following the confrontation, She consistently focused on the broader implications rather than personal vindication. "This was never about me versus Dr. Peterson," she told one interviewer. "This was about the idea that some people get to decide who's qualified to participate in democracy and who isn't." Dr. Peterson's private comments revealed that he doesn't actually believe in democratic equality. He believes in by experts, with himself as one of the experts deciding who gets to count. Also used the moment to highlight the importance of preparation and homework in political discourse. "Dr. Peterson made the mistake of assuming that because he didn't respect me, I wasn't worth taking seriously. That's a dangerous approach to any challenge, whether it's political debate or anything else in life. If you underestimate your opponent because of your own prejudices, you're setting yourself up for failure." The incident had lasting effects on both of their careers. Peterson, who had been building influence in American conservative circles, found many doors suddenly closed to him. His speaking engagements were canceled, his book sales dropped, and his social media following began to decline as people questioned whether his other public statements could be trusted. Crockett, meanwhile, found herself elevated to a new level of national prominence. She was invited to speak at universities, appeared on major television programs, and saw her influence within her own party grow significantly. More importantly, she had proven that underestimated politicians could be far more formidable than their critics assumed. The debate also changed how political confrontations were covered by the media. Journalists began paying more attention to the preparation and research that went into high-profile debates. Several news organizations started fact-checking, not just politicians' public statements, but also investigating whether their private comments matched their public positions. Perhaps most significantly, the incident became a case study in political strategy. Crockett's approach: gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment, and then systematically dismantling her opponents. Credibility was studied by political operatives across the spectrum. The idea that patience and preparation could be more effective than immediate retaliation became a popular topic in political strategy circles. Recording itself raised ethical questions about privacy and political accountability. While most agreed that public figures should be held accountable for their statements, some questioned whether private conversations should be fair game for political attacks. Others argued that when someone builds their public brand around honesty and authenticity, their private statements become relevant to their public credibility. As the dust settled, the debate was remembered as a turning point in American political discourse. It demonstrated that assumptions about intellectual superiority could be dangerous, that preparation could triumph over prejudice, and that underestimating opponents based on demographics or stereotypes was a recipe for disaster. The incident also highlighted the growing importance of social media in shaping political narratives. The speed with which clips spread and memes developed showed how quickly public opinion could shift in the digital age. Politicians and commentators alike learned that a single moment of exposure could undo years of reputation building. Looking back, political historians would mark the Peterson-Crockett debate as an example of how the American political landscape was evolving. Traditional authority based on credentials and reputation was increasingly being challenged by politicians and activists who were willing to do the homework necessary to hold powerful figures accountable. For voters, the debate provided a masterclass in how to evaluate political commentary and public figures. It showed the importance of looking beyond surface-level credentials to examine whether commentators' actions matched their stated values. It also demonstrated that politicians who were dismissed by elites might actually be more competent and prepared than their critics assumed. The aftermath of the debate continued to reverberate for months. Peterson attempted several comebacks, appearing on friendly programs to try to explain his comments and rebuild his reputation. But the damage was too severe, and his influence never recovered to its previous levels. Crockett, meanwhile, used her newfound prominence to advance the policy agenda that had brought her to Congress in the first place. She became a sought-after surrogate for other Democratic candidates and a frequent guest on television programs discussing political strategy and democratic participation. The debate's legacy extended beyond the immediate political impact. It became required viewing in political science classes, studied as an example of how thorough preparation and strategic thinking could overcome perceived disadvantages. It also became a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual arrogance and the importance of taking all opponents seriously. As we look back on this remarkable confrontation, several lessons emerge that remain relevant for anyone engaged in political discourse or public debate. First, assumptions about intellectual superiority can be dangerous and self-defeating. Second, preparation and research are more valuable than credentials or reputation. Third, private statements that contradict public positions will eventually be exposed in our interconnected world. But perhaps most importantly, Peterson-Crockett debate reminded Americans that democracy works best when everyone participates seriously, honestly. It showed that voters are capable of recognizing authenticity and preparation, and that they will reward politicians who do their homework while punishing those who rely on arrogance and assumptions. The recording changed everything. Didn't just expose one person's hypocrisy, it revealed fundamental truths about power, preparation, and respect in American democracy. And in the end, it proved that sometimes the people dismissed as having the intellectual depth of a puddle are the ones doing the deepest thinking of all. What do you think about this incredible political showdown? Did Crockett handle this the right way? Or should political debates avoid these kinds of personal confrontations? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more amazing political moments like this. One that are reshaping American democracy. The next big confrontation could happen at any moment, and you won't want to miss it when it does.